The Byzantine Empire began not as a separate world, but as the eastern survival of Rome. In late antiquity, the Roman Empire was still one state, though increasingly difficult to govern from a single center. Constantine founded Constantinople in 330, and the city gradually drew power, wealth, and administration away from older Roman centers. That shift mattered because the Eastern Empire did more than preserve Roman rule. Over time, it took on a different language, culture, and political shape. Latin traditions remained important for a long time, but Greek became the everyday language of government and educated life. The state still called itself Roman, yet it became distinct in practice, and it endured long after the western half had fallen. In the late Roman world, the empire was still powerful, but it was under growing strain. Civil war, border warfare, taxation, succession disputes, and the sheer scale of the state all pressed at once. Emperors had to answer threats on several frontiers while also dealing with rival commanders, rebellious provinces, and courts that could turn quickly from loyalty to division. Over time, it became harder for one ruler in one city to direct everything at once. By the 3rd century, those pressures had already produced repeated breakdowns. Emperors came and went rapidly. Some ruled only briefly before being killed, replaced, or challenged by another claimant. Modern historians often call this the crisis of the 3rd century, not because it was one event, but because it was a long period of instability. The empire survived, but only by adapting. Local armies became more important. Provincial commanders gained influence. Emergency measures became routine. The eastern provinces were not free from danger, but they had advantages that made them more resilient. Many were richer, especially the urban centers and trade routes around the eastern Mediterranean. They also stood closer to older Hellenistic cities with long traditions of administration, learning, and commerce. Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and the Balkans all mattered to the imperial economy, though not equally or steadily. The East could still draw on dense populations and establish tax systems, giving it a stronger base than many Western regions when repeated crises began to weaken central authority. That difference grew more important as the empire's political center of gravity shifted. As emperors traveled with their armies, power was no longer tied to one old republican capital in the West. Diocletian's reforms at the end of the 3rd century reflected that reality. He did not divide the empire into separate states, but he did create a system that was easier to manage regionally. Power was shared among rulers and deputies, and administration became more segmented. It did not solve every problem, but it acknowledged that the empire could no longer be governed in the old way. The eastern half benefited from that arrangement because it was less exposed to collapse. Its cities remained productive, and the sea lanes connecting them made it easier to move grain, taxes, and officials than through overland control of the whole empire. The Danube frontier and the eastern frontier with Persia both required attention, but the east had more resources to meet those demands. Many western regions faced stronger pressure from frontier peoples, weaker tax bases, and growing political fragmentation. The empire was still one system, but the difference in durability was becoming clear. Civil wars made the strain worse. Roman emperors often came to power through military backing, so each succession carried danger. A ruler who lost the support of troops, generals, or court officials could quickly become vulnerable. Rival claimants were not rare exceptions. They were a recurring feature of late Roman politics. Each conflict drained manpower and money that might otherwise have gone to frontier defense or public works. Each victory also created new obligations, because the winner had to reward supporters and stabilize the regions that had backed the losing side. The eastern provinces were able to absorb more of this pressure than many western areas. Part of the reason was that the eastern administrative network remained more intact. Part was the presence of major cities that could serve as centers of finance and government. Antioch, Alexandria, Nicomedia, and other urban hubs were important long before Constantinople became dominant. They did not simply survive by chance. They helped keep the state working when imperial politics became unsettled. Frontier defense added another layer of difficulty. The Roman Empire had long borders, and the pressures on them changed over time. In the east, Persian power remained a constant concern. In the north, groups moving across or near the Danube created repeated military demands. Later sources sometimes compress these into a single story of invasion, but the reality was more complicated. Sometimes the state fought organized enemies, sometimes it negotiated, bribed, or resettled groups. Sometimes it did all three. The important point is that Rome's borders required continuous effort, and that effort pulled the imperial system in many directions. By the early 4th century, the empire was moving toward a more eastern political center even before Constantinople fully emerged. Constantine's rise mattered in part because he succeeded in a world where authority followed military and administrative usefulness, not old tradition alone. When he founded Constantinople, he was not inventing a new empire from nothing. He was choosing a stronger base for an empire that had already become harder to govern from the older Western centers. The Bosporus was strategically valuable, but that value made sense because the eastern provinces were still functioning well enough to support it. What had once been the eastern half of Rome was becoming the place where Roman power could most reliably endure. The old unity was still formally there, and people of the time would not have described themselves as living in a separate Byzantine state. But the practical center of gravity was changing. Constantine's decision to found a new capital was a practical answer to an old administrative problem. The Roman Empire had grown too large and too uneven for every major decision to pass easily through the old centers in Italy. By the early 4th century, emperors spent much of their time moving with armies, answering frontier crises, and keeping rivals from using their absence against them. A capital had to do more than preserve tradition. It had to sit near the main strategic fronts, support the court, and let imperial authority reach the places where trouble most often began. Constantine came to power after years of civil war, and that experience shaped his rule. He defeated rivals one by one, including Maxentius in 312 and Licinius in 324. Once that struggle ended, he could reorganize the empire on his own terms. He did not abandon Rome in a symbolic break, and he did not erase the older city from imperial memory. Rome still mattered as a source of prestige, law, and historical legitimacy. But Constantine understood that effective rule required a base better suited to the realities of the 4th century. That is why the site on the Bosporus mattered so much. The city that became Constantinople was not built on empty ground. It had earlier existed as Byzantium, a Greek city with long strategic value because it stood on the narrow waterway linking the Aegean and the Black Sea. Constantine chose that location because it connected Europe and Asia, controlled movement between the seas, and was easier to defend than many inland capitals. It also lay closer to the wealthier eastern provinces, which had remained more stable than much of the Western Empire. The new capital was placed where administration, trade, and military response could reinforce one another. The foundation of Constantinople was also a statement of continuity. Constantine presented himself as a Roman emperor, not as the founder of a separate civilization. He filled the new city with institutions that made that claim visible. It received a senate, public buildings, markets, and ceremonial spaces that echoed older imperial practice. Its layout and monuments signaled that the city was meant to be a permanent imperial center, not a temporary military headquarters. Later writers gave the foundation a more dramatic character than the surviving evidence always supports, but the broad historical picture is clear. Constantine raised an existing strategic site into the seat of imperial power. The city was dedicated in 330, and that date has become a convenient marker for the beginning of Constantinople's long political life. Yet its importance did not come from the ceremony alone. It came from the way the city gathered different parts of Roman life into one place. Officials worked there, soldiers passed through it, merchants used it as a port of exchange, courtiers sought influence there. The emperor's presence meant that petitions, taxes, military planning, and patronage all flowed toward the same center. Over time, that concentration gave the city a character unlike any other in the empire. It was Roman in its institutions, Eastern in its position, and increasingly Greek-speaking in daily life. That linguistic shift mattered, though it did not happen overnight. Latin remained important in law, military command, and formal state use for a long time. At the same time, Greek was the language of much of the Eastern Mediterranean, and Constantinople sat inside that older Greek world rather than apart from it. The capital therefore inherited both Roman governmental forms and the wider Eastern cultural environment in which those forms had to operate. This combination would define Byzantine history later on. The empire remained Roman in legal identity, but its center of gravity was moving into a region where Greek language, Eastern trade routes, and Christian institutions all had deep roots. Constantine also linked the new capital to his wider program of imperial reform. He reorganized coinage, strengthened administrative structures, and supported Christianity in ways that changed the public face of Roman rule. Those changes belonged to the same political logic that produced Constantinople. A ruler governing a larger, more complicated empire needed a capital that could project authority clearly. The city on the Bosporus did that in physical form. Its walls, harbors, palaces, and ceremonial avenues gave imperial power a permanent address in the east. By building there, Constantine gave the eastern provinces something they had not had before, a capital that belonged to them directly. That did not split the empire in law, but it did change how people experienced power. Officials, church leaders, generals, and merchants increasingly understood that the decisive center of imperial life was no longer fixed in the old Italian world. It was now anchored where the empire was most likely to endure. Constantine's support for Christianity did not make the empire Christian overnight, and it did not create a fully unified church. For much of the 4th century, Roman religion changed in stages. Older pagan practices continued in many places, while Christian communities gained legal standing, patronage, and influence. The turning point came in 313, when Constantine and Licinius issued the Edict of Milan. It granted toleration to Christians and restored confiscated property. That was not yet Christianity as the state religion, but it ended the long period in which Christians lived under the threat of periodic persecution. What followed was a gradual change in public life. Bishops became more visible as local leaders. Church councils mattered not only for theology, but also for imperial order, because disputes inside Christianity could disturb cities, provinces, and court politics. Constantine himself took an active role in trying to settle these disagreements, most famously at the Council of Nicaea in 325. There the Church addressed the Arian controversy over the relationship between the Father and the Son. The details belonged to doctrine, but the political point was plain. An emperor seeking unity could not treat religion as a private concern when bishops, congregations, and regional loyalties crossed provincial boundaries. This was one reason the Christian order mattered so much for Byzantium later on. Roman emperors had long claimed a role in preserving religious peace, but Christianity gave that role a new shape. The emperor was still a ruler, not a priest, yet he was increasingly expected to support orthodoxy, convene councils, and defend the church from division. Imperial government and Christian institutions began shaping one another. Bishops received imperial favors and legal privileges, while emperors relied on bishops as trusted public figures who could steady cities and communicate imperial policy to local communities. The process was neither simple nor immediate, and it remained contested. Different Christian groups continued to argue over doctrine in the decades after Constantine. Some emperors favored one theological position, then another. Church leaders sometimes resisted imperial pressure, and imperial pressure sometimes strengthened church authority rather than weakening it. Even so, the long-term direction is clear. Christianity was moving from a persecuted faith to an organized public institution, and the imperial court was becoming involved in its structure. A major part of that development lay in organization. The Christian church was not a single office spread evenly across the empire. It had bishops, metropolitan sees, and major centers such as Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and later Constantinople. These cities gained importance not only because of size or wealth, but because their bishops could influence wider regions. Councils gave this hierarchy greater definition, and imperial backing gave it legal and political weight. Over time, church offices came to resemble a parallel system of administration, one that could work alongside Roman government while also sometimes competing with it. This mattered, especially in the Eastern Empire, where cities were dense, trade was active, and the imperial court was close at hand. In those settings, bishops often became important intermediaries. They helped manage poor relief, represented communities to officials, and defended local interests in ways that made them indispensable. The empire was not abandoning old Roman habits so much as adapting them. Where pagan temples and civic cults had once linked religion to city identity, Christian churches now began to fill part of that role. There was also a deeper change in public language. Christian ideas increasingly appeared in imperial laws, official ceremonies, and the way rulers described their legitimacy. Constantine did not erase older Roman titles or symbols, and many familiar forms of authority remained. But by supporting Christianity, he made it harder for later emperors to ignore the church. A ruler who had allied himself with Christian victory could not easily step outside Christian expectations afterward. That is one reason the empire's future history became so closely tied to theological disputes. The church was no longer merely present inside the empire, it was becoming one of the institutions through which empire expressed itself. By the time Constantine's successors continued his policies, the relationship between emperor and church had already changed the public meaning of Roman rule. The empire was still Roman in law and administration, but its capital, its court culture, and increasingly its religious life were shifting eastward and Christianizing together. That did not solve the empire's political problems. It gave the state a new source of unity, but also new controversies over doctrine, authority, and orthodoxy. When Theodosius I came to power in the late 4th century, the Roman Empire was still officially one state, even if it no longer worked as a simple whole. The eastern provinces were richer and more urbanized than much of the west, with stronger tax revenues and cities that had recovered better from earlier crises. The West faced heavier military pressure and relied on a weaker fiscal base. That difference did not yet create a permanent split, but it meant each half was already developing under different conditions. Theodosius ruled first in the east and later as the last emperor to govern the Roman Empire without a serious rival. He came to power during repeated crisis, when emperors were often made and removed by civil war, and when army loyalty mattered as much as formal succession. He had to deal with Gothic settlement on Roman soil, frontier warfare, and the challenge of holding together a vast state with uneven resources. His reign showed how much the empire had changed. An emperor was still expected to command armies and uphold Roman order, but he also had to negotiate with barbarian groups, church leaders, and regional elites whose support had become increasingly necessary. One of the main problems of his reign was the settlement of the Gothic peoples after the disasters of the 370s and 380s. Later accounts sometimes simplify these events, but the situation was more complicated. The Goths were not a single fixed nation in the modern sense, and Roman policy toward them mixed force, treaty, resettlement, and compromise. The empire could not always destroy every threat outright, so it often tried to absorb groups into the imperial system on terms that would reduce immediate danger. That was not an ideal solution, but it reflected the limits of late Roman power. The Eastern government had enough administrative strength to bargain, divide, and contain where conquest was too costly. At the same time, Theodosius deepened the Christian character of imperial rule. He did not invent Christian emperorship, but he helped define a more explicit imperial orthodoxy. His reign is closely associated with the Council of Constantinople in 381, which clarified and extended Nicene Christianity in imperial policy. The council did not end all doctrinal conflict, and later debate continued, but it marked a decisive shift. Imperial power was no longer simply tolerating Christianity, it was increasingly using law, councils, and patronage to shape the church's public form. That mattered because it linked religious unity more closely to political unity. Theodosius also governed through a practical division of labor. By this point, emperors often appointed colleagues to manage different regions, not because the Roman world had officially become two separate states, but because one ruler could not supervise every frontier at once. The arrangement was meant to improve administration, not announce permanent separation. Still, once imperial courts, armies, and tax systems developed different rhythms in East and West, those habits became harder to reverse. The Eastern court at Constantinople grew more secure, more bureaucratic, and more able to project continuity. The Western court, whether at Milan, Ravenna, or elsewhere, faced a harsher military situation and a more fragile fiscal position. The same imperial title covered both, but the reality of rule was beginning to diverge. Theodosius's last major political act made that divergence clearer. When he died in 395, the empire was divided between his sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. This was not the first time a Roman emperor had shared power with a colleague, and it was not presented as the end of Roman unity. Officially, the empire remained one civilization, one law, and one imperial tradition. But the practical result was that each court now had its own center of gravity, its own advisors, and its own immediate problems. The East inherited the stronger position. It had Constantinople, a robust tax base, and a more defensible strategic location. The West inherited the harder task. It still claimed the full Roman legacy, but it would soon find that symbolic unity was easier to preserve than administrative control. That was the real importance of Theodosius's reign. He represented the last moment when the Roman Empire could still appear, in a broad political sense, unbroken. After him, the eastern half would continue to call itself Roman, and it was Roman in law, ceremony, and official self-understanding, but it would do so while learning to operate more and more on its own. In the 5th century, the Eastern Roman Empire faced pressures that might have broken a less resilient state. The Huns first appeared as frontier raiders, and then as a larger force shaping politics along the Danube. Gothic groups moved through imperial territory, sometimes as enemies and sometimes as negotiated settlers, and the government had to decide again and again whether to fight, pay, resettle, or delay. These were not signs of sudden collapse. They were repeated emergencies in a state trying to hold order across a long and uneven frontier. What made the Eastern Empire different from the Western half was not an absence of danger, but the ability to answer danger in several ways at once. Constantinople was protected by strong walls and a favorable position. The eastern provinces, especially Egypt and parts of Asia Minor and Syria, still brought in revenue. The court could pay soldiers, bargain with enemies, and absorb setbacks without immediately losing its core territory. When a frontier crisis appeared, Eastern rulers often turned to diplomacy first, not out of weakness, but because it was cheaper than war and could buy time. That practical style of rule is visible in the long struggles with the Huns. Under Attila, the Hunnic Confederation became a major threat to both halves of the empire, but the Eastern court had already learned to negotiate cautiously. Tribute was sometimes paid, envoys were sent, Hostages and gifts became part of the political language of the age. Modern historians usually see these arrangements not as simple humiliation, but as evidence of a state trying to protect its center by managing its margins. The Eastern emperors were not powerless. They were choosing which losses they could afford in order to avoid larger ones. At the same time, the East benefited from the fact that the West absorbed many of the worst shocks. The Western court struggled with competing generals, weaker finances, and repeated loss of territory. As Roman authority broke apart there, Eastern rulers watched carefully and learned from the disorder without sharing all of its burden. The empire was still one in theory, but in practice the East increasingly had to think for itself. That meant tighter control at court, more careful taxation, and a willingness to make decisions that protected Eastern stability even when they did little to save the Western provinces. The 5th century also showed how often the Eastern government relied on people who stood at the edge of Roman identity. Barbarian leaders were recruited into service, granted ranks, or used against rival factions. This could be dangerous. A general with an outside following might become a problem of his own, but it was also part of how the empire survived. The Eastern state was not a sealed system. It absorbed outsiders, classified them, and used them when possible. That flexibility helped it endure while many Western structures failed. A turning point came in the reign of Leo of Pard, who ruled from 457 to 474, and then under Zeno. Both faced the same basic problem: how to keep the army loyal, the capital stable, and the frontier from holding under the pressure of migrating peoples and military strongmen. Zeno's reign was especially troubled by rebellion and rivalry, including the revolt of Basiliscus and the disruptive movements of Gothic forces. Even then, the Eastern government did not break apart the way some Western administrations did. It bent under pressure, adjusted its alliances, and kept the imperial office intact. The final collapse of the Western imperial court in 476 did not create the Eastern Empire, but it changed the terms under which the East understood itself. When Romulus Augustulus was deposed in Italy, the Eastern Emperor remained the only Roman emperor in official existence. That did not mean the East suddenly became a different civilization. It still called itself Roman. It still used Roman law and imperial offices. But from that point forward, there was no need to pretend that another court in the West shared equal authority. The Eastern state had survived long enough to become the main carrier of Roman continuity. This survival rested on geography, revenue, diplomacy, and a habit of improvisation that became one of Byzantium's deepest political traits. The empire learned to endure by balancing force and compromise, by defending key regions instead of trying to hold everything equally, and by accepting that empire could mean managed contraction as well as expansion. By the end of the 5th century, the Eastern Roman state had not solved its problems. It had simply proved that it could live through them. If the Eastern Roman state survived the 5th century by being practical, the 6th opened with a ruler less interested in mere survival. Justinian, I came to the throne in 527 and inherited an empire that was intact, but still under pressure, guarding long frontiers and living with the memory of Western collapse. He did not accept that condition as permanent. He treated it as the beginning of a larger project, to restore Roman power, organize it more carefully, and present it under a strong emperor in Constantinople. Justinian's ambition was military, administrative, and ideological at once. He wanted the empire to be more than the surviving eastern half of Rome. He wanted it to appear in law, ceremony, and conquest as the lawful continuation of Rome in its fullest sense. That meant the emperor had to stand at the center of public life, not only as a commander, but as the source of legitimate order. It also meant the state had to speak more clearly about what it was and what it ruled. The early years of his reign showed how seriously he took that task. Working with officials such as the Juris Tribonian, Justinian reorganized Roman law. This was not just routine administration. In an empire layered with old statutes, commentaries, and imperial rulings, law was one of the main ways an emperor could unify the state. Justinian wanted the legal tradition sorted, cleaned, and presented as a coherent whole. That effort produced what later became known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, including the Code, the Digest, the Institutes, and later the novels. Modern historians generally regard it as one of the great legal achievements of late antiquity, though its immediate effect was less a sudden transformation than a long-term strengthening of administration and legal memory. That reform fit the wider style of Justinian's government. He favored centralization and trusted his own authority. He also relied on the Empress Theodora, whose role is known through a mix of contemporary and later sources. Procopius, writing within Justinian's world, gives vivid accounts of the court, though not always neutral ones. His secret history is especially hostile and is treated cautiously, Even so, the court in Justinian's reign was unusually active in religion, taxation, diplomacy, and public order. The emperor did not rule at a distance. He aimed to shape the structure of imperial life. Religion was part of that program. By the 6th century, Christianity was already central to Roman identity in the East, but Justinian pushed further. He presented himself as a guardian of orthodoxy, supported councils, intervened in theological disputes, and treated religious unity as part of imperial stability. In his view, the empire should be one in law, one in doctrine, and as far as possible, one in obedience. That was difficult to achieve, especially when doctrinal disputes divided cities, provinces, and church leaders, but it shows how Justinian understood power. He did not separate statecraft from faith. He used each to reinforce the other. Constantinople mattered more than ever in this vision. The city was not just a seat of government, it was the physical expression of Roman continuity in the East. By Justinian's time, it had become a vast, wealthy capital, protected by walls and filled with courts, churches, markets, and administrative buildings. If old Rome had once stood at the center of an expanding Mediterranean order, Constantinople now stood at the center of a more defensible and more bureaucratic imperial system. It was still Roman, but Roman under different conditions. That difference became stark in 532, when Constantinople was shaken by the Nika Revolt. The uprising began with faction politics, especially the rivalry between the Blues and the Greens, which were more than sports groups but not full political parties in the modern sense. They could channel anger, patronage, and public grievance. In this case, a crisis involving arrests and executions helped turn unrest into broader revolt. The sources agree on the scale of the violence, though they differ in detail. The important point is that the uprising was not random. It showed how tightly court politics, public disorder, and imperial legitimacy were bound together in the capital. Justinian appears to have been seriously threatened, and some sources suggest he considered flight. What is not in doubt is that the revolt became a direct test of his authority. Imperial troops, led in part by generals such as Belisarius and Mundus, crushed the rebellion in the Hippodrome. The destruction was severe, and the city had to be rebuilt. But the revolt did not end Justinian's program. In a way, it sharpened it. A ruler who had just faced such a crisis had to present renewed control, and the rebuilding that followed became part of that message. The most famous result was Hagia Sophia. The church we know today was not the first on the site, but the building commissioned after the Nika Revolt became the great architectural statement of Justinian's age. It was completed in 537, and its scale, dome, and interior effect made it a landmark of Byzantine civilization. It combined imperial patronage, Christian devotion, and technical ambition. It also showed a characteristic feature of Byzantine power, the ability to turn crisis into display. The old city had been damaged. The new city would announce recovery in stone and light. At the same time, the legal reforms continued to support the emperor's claim to order. The Corpus Juris Civilis did not remove complexity, but it gave the empire a more unified legal language. In later centuries, especially in the medieval West, it would become enormously influential. In Justinian's own time, it strengthened the idea that Roman rule could be systematized and renewed. Later writers and modern historians have sometimes called this renovatio imperii. The phrase is useful, though it should not suggest a simple return to the past. Justinian was not trying to recreate the early empire exactly. He was trying to make 6th century imperial power look like the rightful heir of Rome. That claim also shaped foreign policy. Justinian believed the empire should recover lands once held by Roman rulers in the West. In the 530s, his generals took advantage of instability among the Vandals in North Africa. Belisarius led the campaign that defeated the Vandal kingdom in 533 and 534, bringing North Africa back under imperial control. This was a real success, and it encouraged further action. Italy followed. There, the Ostrogothic kingdom was divided by internal struggle, and Justinian's forces entered a long war that would continue for years. The early stages brought victories, including the recapture of Ravenna, but the conflict proved far harder than the North African campaign. The Reconquests expanded imperial territory, but they also exposed the limits of restoration. Holding distant lands required armies, money, shipping, and local cooperation. North Africa could be integrated more easily than Italy, yet even their defense and administration remained difficult. In Italy, the war devastated towns and farmland, and control changed hands repeatedly. Justinian's empire could strike far from the Bosporus, but every success drew on limited resources. The dream of restoration was real, but it was expensive. That tension between ambition and capacity would define the rest of Justinian's reign. He gave the empire a stronger legal framework and a more imposing public image. He also showed that Roman power could still act decisively outside the eastern core. But as the wars continued, the costs accumulated. The state expanded its claims even as defense, rebuilding, and taxation grew heavier. By the middle of Justinian's reign, the empire had become more ambitious and more brittle. It was wealthier and more visible than it had been a generation earlier, but also more dependent on taxes, order, and the loyalty of Constantinople. The capital sat at the center of that system, and its crowds understood their importance. In the Eastern Roman world, the arena, the streets, the churches, and the court were closely connected. Popular factions could not overthrow emperors on their own, but they could spread anger and turn local disputes into political crisis. That danger became clear in 532, in what is usually called the Nika Revolt. It began in the ordinary and often violent world of Constantinople's factional politics, especially the Blues and the Greens, who were tied to racing but could also carry broader grievances. By then, tension had already built up around taxes, arrests, and resentment toward officials seen as corrupt or overbearing. When supporters from both sides began to unite in protest, the unrest moved beyond rivalry and became a challenge to Justinian himself. The revolt took shape in the Hippodrome and then spread through the city. Contemporary sources, especially Procopius and other writers close to the court, describe a capital that quickly lost normal control. Buildings were burned, officials were attacked, and the imperial center seemed exposed. Much of the surviving evidence comes from authors with political purposes of their own, so the exact motives behind every crowd movement are not always clear. What is clear is that the crisis was not just a spontaneous riot. It was also a test of whether imperial authority could still hold Constantinople when pressure came from below as well as from outside. For a time, Justinian appears to have considered flight. Later accounts say he was persuaded to remain by Theodora, whose words are among the most famous in Byzantine tradition. Because those speeches survive only in literary sources, they should be treated as later reporting rather than verbatim transcript. Even so, the story reflects a broader truth about the moment. The court had to choose between retreat and force. It chose force. Justinian's commanders, including Belisarius and Mundus, moved against the crowds in the Hippodrome, and the uprising was crushed with great loss of life. The exact numbers in later sources are uncertain, but the suppression was severe enough to end the revolt decisively. The consequences were immediate. Justinian survived, but the revolt left no doubt that Constantinople itself had to be managed more carefully. Rebellion in the capital could not be allowed to threaten the throne again in the same way. The state responded by tightening supervision and asserting control more firmly over public life. The revolt also showed how closely order in the city depended on the emperor's ability to balance spectacle, taxation, patronage, and punishment. A city that had seemed to embody Roman continuity could, in a few days, become the center of open danger. The destruction also created room for rebuilding. Large areas of Constantinople had been damaged or burned, including important public and civic spaces. Justinian used the aftermath not only to restore what had been lost, but to reshape the capital in a more imposing form. This mattered because Byzantine power was always partly architectural. The city's buildings were not just practical structures, they communicated authority, orthodoxy, and permanence. After the revolt, that message became even more important. So the Nika Revolt became a turning point in Justinian's reign. It showed the risks of governing a crowded imperial capital, but it also gave him an opportunity to reassert control and rebuild on a grander scale. The emperor emerged more cautious in some respects and more determined in others. Justinian's Byzantine Empire answered the riots in Constantinople with law, church policy, and building. After the Nika Revolt, the emperor moved quickly to show that imperial order had not broken down. One response was legal. The Eastern Roman world still relied on a vast body of older laws, imperial decrees, juristic opinions, and local practice. Over time, that material had become difficult to manage. Different texts could conflict, and some rules had been repeated for generations without being clearly arranged. In the middle of the 6th century, Justinian's government began a major effort to gather, revise, and organize the law. The result was later called the Corpus Juris Civilis, a Latin legal compilation that included the Code, the Digest, the Institutes, and later the Novels. It was an attempt to bring order to inherited Roman law and present it in a more unified and usable form. That effort mattered for more than administration. In the Byzantine Empire, law was one of the main ways the emperor defined himself. A state that claimed to continue Rome needed a ruler who could act as the source and guardian of legal authority. By collecting and clarifying the law, Justinian strengthened the idea that imperial rule could make a fragmented world legible again. The jurists whose work entered the Digest were not all his contemporaries. Much of the legal tradition came from earlier Roman centuries, and later scholars have had to trace carefully how Justinian's editors selected, altered, and harmonized those materials. But the overall purpose is clear enough. The code gave the empire a formal expression of continuity while adapting that continuity to the needs of a 6th century Christian monarchy. Religion moved in the same direction. By Justinian's time, Christianity was central to imperial identity, and the emperor worked to make that relationship visible. The church was not simply an independent institution beside the state. Its hierarchy, councils, and public rituals were tied to imperial patronage and supervision, even if the relationship was never simple or peaceful. Justinian supported orthodoxy, intervened in theological disputes, and presented himself as a ruler responsible for the unity of both the empire and the faith. That did not mean the church obeyed him without tension. Bishops, monks, and theologians could resist or criticize imperial policy, and doctrinal controversy remained a real political problem. But the direction of travel is clear. Byzantine rule increasingly treated correct belief as part of public order. The clearest symbol of that fusion was Hagia Sophia. The great church associated with Justinian was rebuilt after the Nika Revolt, replacing an earlier structure that had been destroyed. Later sources named the architects Anthemios of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, and the building that rose under their direction became one of the most famous monuments in the medieval world. It was not only large, it was designed to make imperial Christianity visible on an extraordinary scale. Its dome, light, and interior space created an effect that later generations often described in awe, though those later accounts should not be treated as direct contemporary testimony. Historically, the important point is that Hagia Sophia joined engineering, ritual, and political message in one place. It gave Constantinople a church that functioned as both a religious center and a statement about empire. That building reflected the wider pattern of Justinian's reign. He did not separate law from worship or worship from public architecture. In his world, these belonged together. A reformed legal order helped define the state. An Orthodox church helped define legitimate belief. Monumental construction made both visible. Constantinople itself was increasingly framed as the center where those things met. The city's walls, forums, churches, and ceremonial routes still carried the memory of Roman power, but they now carried Christian meaning as well. The emperor's authority was not only written in laws or proclaimed in decrees, it was built into the urban landscape. Justinian's building program reached beyond one famous church. He repaired fortifications, funded churches, and encouraged works that tied the capital to the emperor's image. Some projects were practical, some symbolic, and many were both. In a century when rulers faced war, unrest, and doctrinal division, visible construction could suggest permanence even when conditions remained uncertain. It was a way of saying that the empire was not merely surviving, it was still capable of shaping its environment on a grand scale. At the same time, the scale of that ambition showed how much the state depended on resources. Law codes had to be compiled, churches had to be supported, great buildings had to be funded and maintained. The capital's splendor rested on taxation, administration, and labor drawn from across the empire. In this sense, Justinian's monuments were not ornaments added after the fact. They were part of the machinery of rule. They expressed a court culture in which order, faith, and authority were meant to reinforce one another. By the middle of Justinian's reign, Byzantine civilization had taken on a form that later centuries would recognize as classic. It had a more systematic legal tradition, a more explicit Christian imperial ideology, and a capital whose buildings embodied both. Justinian's program did not stop with law and building. It also turned outward. If the empire was to claim it was the true Roman state, it had to recover, at least partly, the western provinces lost in the 5th century. That was a major task. The eastern government was stronger than the western one had been, but it was not limitless. Every campaign had to be paid for, supplied, and defended, and every gain created new obligations. The first major opening came in North Africa. In 533, Justinian sent Belisarius against the Vandal kingdom, which had ruled the former Roman provinces there for about a century. The campaign was unusually swift by late antique standards. The Vandal state was weakened by internal conflict, and the eastern expedition was well led. Carthage fell, and imperial authority returned over much of the region. For Justinian, this was more than a military success. It suggested that Roman recovery was possible. It also gave the empire a valuable grain-producing province and a strategic base in the western Mediterranean. North Africa also showed one of the main limits of Justinian's ambitions. Winning territory was not the same as holding it securely. Restoring Roman rule required garrisons, naval patrols, administrative reorganization, and steady attention from Constantinople. Even where reconquest succeeded, it was difficult to sustain. Local politics, frontier security, and distance all mattered. The empire had regained land, but it had also inherited the burden of defending land that had been outside imperial control for generations. Italy proved harder still. Justinian's war against the Ostrogothic kingdom began in 535 and continued for years. At first, imperial forces advanced well. They took Sicily, entered Rome, and eventually captured Ravenna in 540. But the war did not end there. The Ostrogoths recovered under later leaders, and fighting returned again and again. Cities changed hands, armies crossed an already damaged peninsula, and the conflict became long and destructive. By the end, imperial rule in Italy had been restored in name, but the country itself was exhausted. The state had won territory at a cost that would shape the following decades. There was also a wider Mediterranean dimension to Justinian's policy. Byzantine power in this period was increasingly naval as well as land-based. Control of sea routes mattered for moving troops, supplying cities, and linking the eastern core to newly recovered regions. Success depended not only on battlefield victories, but on logistics, shipping, and the ability to coordinate across long distances. In that sense, the Mediterranean again looked partly like a Roman sea. But it was a fragile version of that older world, because the imperial government had to stretch its resources to maintain it. Justinian's reconquests were real, but partial. They showed that the Eastern Empire could act on a large scale, yet they also exposed how much was required to keep acting that way. A stronger empire could reach farther than the Western one had managed in its last years. Still, every recovered province added pressure to the treasury and the army. The victories in Africa and Italy brought prestige, taxation, and strategic depth, but they also widened the gap between imperial ambition and imperial capacity. That gap became more visible as the 6th century went on. The same reign that produced victories in the West also faced growing strain at home and on the frontiers. Expansion had restored part of the Roman world, but it had not made the empire secure. In that sense, Justinian's reconquests were both a high point and a warning. The strain became harder to ignore in the middle decades of Justinian's reign, because the empire was already carrying several burdens at once. Campaigns in the West were expensive. Frontier defenses still had to be maintained in the east and north, and the government in Constantinople had to keep collecting taxes, paying soldiers, repairing cities, and supplying the capital. Then, in the 540s, a disaster arrived that touched all of those pressures at once, the plague later known as the Justinianic Plague. The best contemporary evidence for the first outbreak comes from writers such as Procopius and John of Ephesus, who both describe a devastating epidemic spreading through the Eastern Roman world. These are not medical reports in the modern sense, but they matter because they show how widely the disease was remembered and how deeply it affected public life. The outbreak is usually dated to 541 and 542, beginning in the Eastern Mediterranean and then moving through the empire's cities, ports, and trade routes. Modern historians generally identify it as a form of bubonic plague, though the exact pathogen and transmission patterns are still studied. Whatever the details, the disruption was severe. People died in large numbers, labor became scarcer, and normal routines of agriculture, transport, and taxation were interrupted. For Justinian's state, that had immediate practical consequences. The government depended on a steady flow of grain, customs revenue, and military recruits. When population losses hit towns and countryside alike, the tax base narrowed. When farms were left short of workers, production fell. When shipping and markets became less predictable, the capital felt the effects in supply and prices. The empire did not stop functioning, but it had to function under harder conditions. A government already stretched by reconquest now had fewer people, less cash, and greater uncertainty. Caution is needed here, because the empire's later difficulties cannot be reduced to a single cause. Wars continued. Climate fluctuations may have affected harvests in some regions, though scholars disagree on how much weight to give that factor. Administrative burdens also remained heavy, and Justinian's fiscal policies were often demanding. Still, the plague clearly worsened existing problems. It did not create every weakness in the system, but it magnified them. The most important effect was not immediate collapse, but cumulative exhaustion. Repeated outbreaks probably returned in later years, though the sources become less complete after the first Great Wave. Each resurgence reinforced the sense that the empire was living with a reduced margin for error. Men still served in the army, officials still collected revenue, and the court still projected authority. But all of that now rested on a thinner social and economic base than before. In the short term, Constantinople remained powerful. In the longer term, the empire was being asked to sustain a scale of activity that was harder to finance than it had been at the start of Justinian's reign. This mattered especially because the empire's enemies were not standing still. In the east, Persia remained the major strategic rival. In the Balkans, new pressures were building from several directions. The Western reconquests had been impressive, but they had not removed the need to defend the older imperial frontiers. By the later 6th century, Byzantium had more territory than before in some regions, and more prestige than the shattered Western Empire had ever recovered, yet it also had less room to absorb shock. Disease, war, and fiscal strain were beginning to interact. That combination helps explain why the empire's momentum slowed after the great achievements of the 530s and 540s. Justinian's reign remained one of the largest moments of imperial ambition in Byzantine history, but the conditions that made that ambition possible were changing. The empire had won important victories, reorganized law, and revived older claims to Roman universality. Now it had to live with the cost of those achievements. By the later 6th and early 7th centuries, the Eastern Empire faced several frontiers at once. In the Balkans, Slavic groups were moving south across the Danube in growing numbers. To the east, the Persian Empire remained Byzantium's most dangerous rival. Between those pressures, the older Roman habit of projecting power outward gave way to a more defensive style of rule. The empire did not stop being Roman, but it had to be Roman in a different way, shaped less by expansion than by the need to preserve what remained. The Balkans changed first. For much of the earlier Roman period, the Danube had served as a border and a line of military organization. That line became harder to hold. Slavic-speaking groups crossed into imperial territory, sometimes raiding, sometimes settling, often moving through regions where Roman authority had already weakened. They were not a single unified people, and the sources are uneven, but the larger pattern is clear. The empire could still send expeditions, negotiate with local leaders, and defend strongpoints, yet it could no longer restore the older frontier system across the whole region. In some areas, towns declined, local administration thinned, and the countryside became more fragmented. What had once been a relatively integrated borderland turned into a patchwork of imperial enclaves, migrating communities and contested routes. The Avars intensified that process. This confederation of steppe origin entered the Danubian world in the later 6th century and quickly became a major force. Unlike the Slavs, who spread through movement and settlement, the Avars worked as a pressure system. They dominated parts of the Carpathian Basin and extracted tribute, raiding opportunities, and submission from neighboring peoples. For Byzantium, that meant dealing not only with direct warfare, but also with the unstable balance among many non-Roman groups beyond the frontier. The Avars could push Slavic groups southward, threaten fortified places, and force the empire into expensive defensive measures. They were also capable of diplomacy, which made them difficult to handle in any simple way. The empire sometimes paid, sometimes fought, and sometimes tried to divide its enemies against one another. That was practical statecraft, but it also showed how far conditions had changed. The Danube frontier was no longer a wall of Roman order, it was a zone of negotiation under pressure. At the same time, the eastern frontier remained tied to the long rivalry with Persia. The Sasanian Empire had its own priorities and ambitions, and the borderlands of Armenia, Mesopotamia, and the Caucasus remained strategically important. These were places where the two empires met, fought, traded, and competed for local allies. Byzantine rulers understood that a war in the east could not be separated from events elsewhere. If resources were tied up in the Balkans, Persia could exploit weakness in the east. If eastern armies advanced too deeply, other frontiers might suffer. The empire had to manage a chain of vulnerabilities rather than a single border. One result was a style of government centered more on logistics, fortifications, taxation, and rapid troop movement. This also changed the meaning of imperial authority. Earlier Roman emperors had often been judged by conquest, public generosity, and the visible expansion of order. In this new frontier world, survival itself became proof of competence. A ruler who could defend cities, preserve revenue, and keep diplomacy from breaking down had already done something important. The emperor was still expected to rule universally in theory, but in practice the state had to be more selective. It fortified key towns, repaired walls, and relied on commanders who understood local conditions. It also leaned more heavily on the sea, especially where land routes had become too exposed. Constantinople mattered because it sat at the center of these routes, watching the Balkans, the Bosporus, and Anatolia at once. Heraclius came to the throne in 610 under these strained conditions, and his reign became one of the clearest responses to the new frontier world. The empire was already under severe pressure when he took power. Internal instability had weakened the state, and Persian forces advanced deeply into imperial territory. In the early years of his reign, Byzantium faced one of the worst crises in its history. Syria and Egypt were threatened or lost, and the empire seemed close to collapse. Heraclius responded by reorganizing resources, shifting strategy, and accepting that older Roman habits were no longer enough. He did not simply defend the borders that existed before, he tried to recover the initiative. That effort produced a remarkable, if costly, success against Persia. In a series of campaigns in the 620s, Heraclius struck deep into Persian territory and helped reverse the balance of the war. Later Christian writers often treated this as a near-miraculous triumph, and it did carry strong ideological meaning. But the basic historical fact is simpler. Imperial forces, under Heraclius, regained enough strength to pressure Persia when the Sasanians were politically unstable. The victory restored imperial prestige and showed that Byzantium could still act as a major military power. It also came at a high cost. Campaigning on that scale demanded money, manpower, and endurance that the empire no longer had in abundance. The war was won, but the state was exhausted. That exhaustion mattered because the next crisis came quickly. The Arab conquests of the 630s and 640s transformed the eastern Mediterranean more decisively than the war with Persia had done. Syrian and Egyptian territory, long central to imperial revenue and administration, fell out of Byzantine control. In a short span, the empire lost some of its richest provinces and some of its most important Christian centers. North Africa followed later, though not all at once. This was not just a military defeat, it was a structural change. The empire that emerged after these losses was smaller, more concentrated, and more clearly organized around Anatolia, the Aegean, and the capital. That altered geography encouraged new forms of defense. Over time, Byzantium developed what modern historians call the theme system, though the details and exact origins are debated. In broad terms, military and administrative districts became more closely linked, especially in Anatolia. Soldiers were settled with land in some regions, and local defense became more tied to local life. This did not mean a simple world of peasant soldiers everywhere, and scholars still debate how early and how uniform the system was. But the general trend is clear. The empire needed a cheaper and more resilient way to defend itself. It could no longer rely on the older, heavily centralized model that had supported the age of expansion under Justinian. Instead, it moved toward a structure in which provincial survival, tax collection, and military readiness were tied together. By this point, Byzantium looked less like a universal empire stretching confidently across the Mediterranean and more like a fortified state organized around pressure points. It still had diplomacy, court ceremony, legal tradition, and theology. But beneath those visible forms was a harder political reality. Slavs altered the Balkans. Avars complicated the Danubian zone. Persia remained a formidable eastern rival. The Arab conquests redrew the map almost overnight. The pressure on Byzantium did not ease after its first adjustments to a more defensive shape. In the early 7th century, the eastern provinces still provided money, soldiers, and administration, but even that older strength was being tested from several directions at once. The most dangerous challenge came from the Sasanian Persian Empire, Rome's long-standing eastern rival. Earlier emperors had lost and recovered territory before, but the war that began under Phocas and continued under Heraclius became far more destructive. It reached deep into the empire's most important lands and exposed how fragile imperial control had become. Heraclius took power in 610 after overthrowing Phocas, whose rule had already been weakened by military failure and political disorder. The empire he inherited was in poor condition. Persian armies had taken advantage of the chaos and pushed across the eastern frontier with unusual success. In the years that followed, they captured major Roman cities and provinces, including Antioch in 6111, Jerusalem in 614, and Alexandria in 6119. These were not minor losses. They struck at the old urban centers of the eastern Mediterranean. With Syria and Egypt threatened or occupied, Byzantium lost territory that had once provided revenue, grain, and strategic depth. For a time, collapse seemed possible. Heraclius responded by changing how the war was fought. He did not simply wait behind the walls of Constantinople. He reorganized finances, sought church support, and used the empire's remaining naval and diplomatic advantages to keep the state functioning. Contemporary sources show a court and army under severe strain, while later narratives often turned Heraclius into a heroic restorer. The reality was more practical and more difficult. He had to rebuild military capacity while the empire's normal systems of taxation and supply were under pressure. That required borrowing, negotiation, and a willingness to take risks. A turning point came when Heraclius moved the war into Persian territory. Beginning in 622, he led campaigns into the Caucasus and beyond, relying on maneuver, alliance-making, and timing rather than sheer numbers. He won important victories and gradually forced the Persians onto the defensive. In 626, while Heraclius was campaigning away from the capital, Constantinople itself faced a combined attack by Persian forces and the Avars. The city survived, helped by its walls, its fleet, and the failure of the attackers to coordinate effectively across the Bosporus. That defense mattered because Constantinople remained the political center of the empire. If it had fallen, the Eastern Roman state might have broken apart entirely. The war then swung back in Heraclius's favor. In 627, he defeated the Persians at Nineveh, and the internal weakness of the Sasanian court became impossible to hide. Soon after, Khosrow II was overthrown and killed. The new Persian leadership sued for peace, and Heraclius recovered the territories and symbolic objects that Persian forces had seized, including the true cross according to Christian tradition and later accounts. The return of lost holy sites gave the victory strong religious meaning in Byzantine memory. For a moment, imperial restoration seemed to have succeeded. But the success came at a high cost. The war had drained manpower, exhausted the treasury, and disrupted the eastern frontier for years. The empire had won back territory, but it had not repaired the damage fully. Heraclius had restored Roman control in a formal sense, yet the state was weaker than it had been before the war began. That mattered because a new danger was already rising on the southern frontier. The early Arab conquests followed almost immediately after the war with Persia. The exact reasons for their speed are still debated, but the broad sequence is clear. Byzantine and Persian armies had both been exhausted by decades of fighting, and the political and military systems of the Near East were unsettled. From the 630s onward, Arab forces defeated Byzantine armies and took advantage of the region's instability. Syria was lost after the Battle of Yarmouk in 636, a decisive defeat that opened the Levant to Muslim control. Jerusalem fell in 637 or 638, and Egypt, one of the empire's most valuable provinces, was taken by 642. North Africa would follow over time, though not all at once. For Byzantium, this was more than a territorial loss. It marked a new imperial reality. The empire that had just recovered from Persia now had to live without the richest lands of the eastern Mediterranean. Syria and Egypt had been central to Roman imperial life for centuries. Their loss changed the scale of the state, its finances, and its military horizon. Yet the empire did endure. Constantinople remained intact. Anatolia stayed in Byzantine hands. The state survived because it could contract, defend a smaller core, and adapt its institutions to a harsher map. The loss of the eastern provinces did not happen at once, and the imperial response unfolded gradually as well. After the first Arab victories, Byzantine policy shifted from trying to recover every city quickly to preserving what could still be defended. That was not the collapse of government, but a different kind of state organized for survival. In the decades after Yarmouk and the fall of Egypt, the front line moved north and west. Byzantine commanders no longer expected to hold Syria or the Nile Valley. Their main task became the defense of Anatolia, the Aegean coast, and the approaches to Constantinople. The sea mattered more as the land frontier became harder to secure. When Arab fleets appeared in the eastern Mediterranean, Byzantium relied on naval defense, fortified cities, and the strength of a capital that was still difficult to take by force. At that point, the empire's reduced scale became permanent rather than temporary. Syria and Egypt had supplied a large share of imperial revenue, and their loss forced the state to raise troops and maintain order in new ways. Older Roman administrative habits survived, but they were adapted to a smaller and more exposed territory. The center of gravity moved farther into Asia Minor, where the countryside could still provide soldiers and supplies if it was organized carefully. Byzantine leaders also came to value diplomacy as much as battle. Not every frontier danger could be answered with a major campaign. At times, the empire bought time through negotiation, tribute, or the use of rivalries among neighboring powers. That was not simple weakness. It was practical statecraft in a region where direct recovery was often impossible. The court in Constantinople still hoped to regain lost ground, but its immediate task was to endure. The loss of territory also changed the army. In the 7th century, Byzantium moved gradually toward regional military organization in Anatolia. Scholars describe that transition in different ways, but the overall pattern is clear. Soldiers became more closely tied to local districts, and defense was linked more tightly to provincial society. The state needed men who could live near the front, know the landscape, and respond quickly to raids. This did not replace older structures at once, but it gave the empire a way to function with fewer resources. At the same time, the Arab state became a lasting power, with its own political and religious center. Byzantium now faced a neighbor that was organized, expansive, and permanent. Syria was no longer a Byzantine province. Egypt was no longer a reliable tax base. North Africa would also be contested and gradually lost, though unevenly and over time. Each change reduced the empire's reach, but none of them ended its continuity. What emerged was a transformation in scale. Byzantium ceased to be the universal Roman Empire of late antiquity and became a more concentrated state centered on Constantinople and Anatolia. It had fewer provinces, fewer revenues, and less room for error. As the empire shrank, its government faced a practical problem that late Roman institutions had not solved on this scale. It had to defend less territory with fewer taxes, fewer soldiers, and constant pressure on its borders. The answer was not a single reform, but a gradual shift in which land, military service, and provincial administration became more closely linked. Out of that shift came the theme system, one of the most important developments in Byzantine history. The themes were military districts, especially in Asia Minor, where soldiers were settled on land and expected to serve when called. The origins of the system are still debated. Modern historians do not agree on whether it emerged quickly from emergency measures in the 7th century or developed more gradually from earlier arrangements, and the surviving sources do not give a clear founding date. What is clear is the direction of change. Instead of relying mainly on distant field armies and older provincial structures, the empire increasingly tied defense to local forces that could respond more quickly to invasion. In a state that could no longer afford to lose whole regions and then recover them, speed and flexibility mattered. This arrangement changed provincial life as well as military life. A soldier who held land had a direct stake in the survival of the district around him. Local communities were no longer separated from imperial defense in the way they had been during the earlier Roman order. Farms, villages, and market towns became part of a system that supported watchfulness, mobilization, and supply. The empire still had emperors, ministers, and generals in Constantinople, but the countryside now carried more of the burden of survival. Military and civilian life became more closely connected than they had been in earlier imperial centuries. The themes did not turn every peasant into a professional soldier, and they did not remove larger armies or elite command. The Byzantine state remained more complex than a simple militia system, but the themes did give it a way to spread responsibility across a wider social base. In some places, that strengthened local resilience. In others, it placed heavy pressure on rural families, especially when war, taxes, or bad harvests came together. Like many Byzantine institutions, it was both adaptive and burdensome. It made the empire more survivable, but not uncomplicated. This was especially important because the empire's remaining core lay increasingly in Anatolia, the plateau and coastal regions of Asia Minor. That territory was large enough to matter, but close enough to eastern war zones to need constant vigilance. The old frontier model, with broad Mediterranean control and deep provincial depth, no longer applied. The state now had to organize defense closer to home. The themes helped create that defensive geography. They made the empire less dependent on fragile long-distance reinforcement and more dependent on locally rooted structures that could endure repeated shocks. Over time, this also shaped social hierarchy. Landholding, military service, and imperial obligation became linked in new ways, even though the details varied from province to province. Some landholders accumulated influence. Some soldiers became local notables. Tax obligations and service obligations were not always neatly separated. The countryside became a place where military survival and ordinary economic life were woven together. That is part of why Byzantine history in this period cannot be understood only through emperors and battles. Rural society mattered because it was helping hold the state together. The importance of this system is easier to see when compared with the losses of the 7th century. Syria and Egypt had once supplied revenue, grain, and manpower on a scale the Eastern Empire could not replace. After those provinces were gone, the old imperial machine had to become smaller and more self-reliant. The themes were one of the main ways it did so. They did not restore the old empire, and they were not meant to. They helped create a different one, more defensive in posture and more regional in organization, but still capable of continuity. That new balance did not solve every problem. It gave Byzantium time and structure, but it also made the empire more aware of the pressure on each frontier. By tying soldiers to land and local administration to defense, the state accepted a hard truth. Survival would depend on closer coordination between the capital and the provinces. By the 8th century, the empire's survival depended on more than armies and fortresses. It also depended on agreement about imperial authority, church teaching, and the public expression of sacred power. Religious dispute was therefore political as well as theological, and questions about doctrine reached into monasteries, palaces, army camps, and city streets. The best-known dispute was iconoclasm, the conflict over sacred images. The central question was whether Christians should honor icons of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints, or whether such practices risked idolatry. Christian art had long existed, and devotion to images had grown over time, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean. But in the early 8th century, emperors began to intervene more forcefully. The first major imperial move, usually associated with iconoclasm, came under Leo III, who ruled from 717 to 741. The evidence for his motives is limited, and later sources are deeply partisan. Some historians point to military setbacks, cultural change, or concern about divine favor. What is clear is that the imperial government came to regard images as a matter it had the right to regulate. Under Leo III, and especially his son Constantine V, opposition to icons became state policy. Constantine V, who ruled from 741 to 705, was an effective ruler and a serious military organizer, but later iconophile writers remembered him with hostility because of his religious stance. In 754 he supported the Council of Hieria, which rejected the veneration of icons. That council was later condemned by defenders of images, and the surviving record is shaped by the later victory of the iconophiles. Even so, the pattern is clear. Imperial authority was being used to define acceptable devotion, bringing the emperor into direct tension with monks, bishops, and lay supporters of icons. Monasteries were especially important in this conflict. They were not only religious communities, they were also centers of learning, local influence, and moral prestige. Many monks defended icons because images helped them explain the reality of the incarnation. If Christ truly became human, then depicting him was not a denial of divine truth, but a confession of it. Iconoclast emperors, by contrast, often treated images as dangerous distractions that confused material representation with spiritual worship. The debate was not simply about art. It was about where holiness resided, who could interpret doctrine, and how far imperial authority could reach into religious life. The argument also showed how much Byzantine government depended on public ritual. Icons were part of churches, processions, household devotion, and the visual language of empire. Removing them was not a minor adjustment. It changed the relationship between sacred space and political power. It also created losers. Some bishops complied, some resisted, and many tried to avoid open confrontation, but the issue left a lasting mark because it tied theology to loyalty. To support or oppose icons could be read as a statement about the emperor himself. The first period of iconoclasm weakened after the death of Constantine v. Empress Irene. Acting as regent for her son Constantine VI, restored the veneration of icons at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. That council affirmed that icons could be honored, though not worshipped as God. In Byzantine theology, that distinction mattered, because it allowed the church to defend sacred images without collapsing them into idolatry. Yet the settlement did not end the argument permanently. A second wave of iconoclasm began in 815 under Leo V after renewed military pressure and political anxiety. Once again, the imperial government linked reform of devotion with reform of the state. The second iconoclast period lasted for decades, but it never erased the case for images. Over time, opposition hardened, especially in monastic circles and among theologians who treated icon veneration as part of Orthodox practice. The final restoration came in 843 under Empress Theodora, acting for her young son Michael III. This event was later celebrated in the Orthodox tradition as the triumph of orthodoxy. The name reflects the winner's view of the dispute, but the historical significance is plain enough. The empire had spent more than a century arguing over the place of images, and the result was not just a doctrinal answer, it was a clearer sense that imperial authority had limits, and that the church could not simply be reduced to an arm of the state. That did not mean the emperors became weak. Byzantine rulers continued to play a central role in church affairs, and they remained deeply involved in councils, appointments, and public ceremony. But the iconoclastic crisis changed expectations. It showed that religious identity could not be managed by decree alone. It had to be negotiated through tradition, liturgy, and the loyalties of clergy and laity alike. The end of iconoclasm did not bring an immediate golden age, but it did remove one of the empire's longest internal disputes. Byzantium still faced practical tasks, governing effectively, collecting taxes, managing its provinces, and defending its frontiers against stronger neighbors. Out of that need came the period usually associated with the Macedonian dynasty, named for Basil I, and the line that followed him, even though the family's origins were modest. The label was applied later to a dynasty that came to stand for recovery. Basil took power in 867 after rising from a humble background to the imperial throne. Later court tradition shaped the story of his early career, and some details remain uncertain, but the political fact is clear enough. His reign marked the start of renewed stability at the center. Basil paid close attention to administration, imperial authority, and the practical business of rule. He strengthened the court, reasserted control where local power had grown too independent, and began a line of emperors who would present themselves as restorers of Roman order. His successor, Leo VI, later called the Wise, continued that administrative and legal emphasis. He is associated with legal compilations and a more systematic approach to imperial government, even as succession disputes and court politics still limited stability. The wider importance of the Macedonian period was that it combined recovery at the center with a more confident style of rule. The empire had survived the long crises of earlier centuries, but survival alone did not create prestige. Under the Macedonian emperors, the state regained enough coherence to act with purpose again. Taxes were collected more effectively, officials were trained to administer provinces with greater regularity. Military and civilian officers were more clearly tied into the imperial hierarchy. These were not dramatic changes, but they shaped the empire's capacity to function. Byzantine's strength often depended on this kind of patient management. A stable bureaucracy could preserve what armies could not always win. That administrative strength also supported a cultural revival. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the empire produced more surviving literature, theological writing, legal commentary, and historical compilation than in the preceding centuries. Some of this reflected preservation, as scholars copied older texts and organized knowledge. Some of it was original work, often connected to the court, the church, or the schools of Constantinople. The capital again became the center of a self-conscious imperial culture. This was not a simple return to classical antiquity, since Byzantine writers worked within a Christian-Roman framework with its own limits and assumptions. But they did inherit and rework older Greek traditions in ways that strengthened the empire's intellectual life. The same period also saw renewed missionary activity and a wider reach beyond the empire's borders. The conversion of the Bulgarians under Boris I, though it involved diplomacy, religion, and politics, gave Byzantium a major success on its northern frontier. The Christianization of the Slavs, especially through Cyril and Methodius and their followers, linked the empire to the development of Slavic literacy and worship. Byzantine influence spread through translation, liturgy, and church organization as much as through force. The result was a broader cultural sphere in which Constantinople remained the leading center. Under Basil II, who ruled from 976 to 1025, the Macedonian Age reached its most forceful form. Later tradition remembered him as the Bulgar Slayer, a title that reflects his hard-won victories over the Bulgarian state, especially after the Battle of Clydian in 1014. The nickname is memorable, but it should not hide the larger shape of his reign. Basil II spent decades strengthening central authority, limiting the power of great aristocratic families, and securing the empire's frontiers. He did not depend on a single dramatic conquest. Instead, he used persistence, taxation, military pressure, and administrative control to recover imperial confidence. That made him one of the most successful Byzantine rulers in the historical record, not because he solved every problem, but because he showed that the empire could still coordinate long campaigns and sustain them. Even so, the Macedonian revival had limits. The empire was stronger than it had been in earlier centuries, but that strength depended on a balance between the court, the army, provincial landowners, and the church. When that balance held, Byzantium could project authority with impressive effectiveness. When it failed, the old problems returned quickly. The achievements of the Macedonian Age made the system look more durable than it truly was, because they rested on capable rulers and favorable conditions that could not be guaranteed forever. By the early 11th century, however, the empire had reached an unusual level of confidence. Court culture was refined, the bureaucracy was experienced, and the territory was larger and more secure than it had been for generations. That is why later historians often describe the period as a revival. The word is useful, as long as it is understood carefully. Byzantium was not revived from nothing. It had never disappeared. But after centuries of contraction and crisis, it now appeared again as a sophisticated imperial power with a recovered sense of continuity. By the 11th century, the Byzantine court had become one of the most disciplined centers of learning in the medieval world. That was not accidental. It grew out of the empire's long habit of preserving Roman institutions while adapting them to Greek language, Christian belief, and changing political realities. The result was a ruling culture that valued education, ceremony, written law, and careful record-keeping. Those habits helped the empire govern a territory that was diverse, wealthy, and often difficult to control directly. Elite education remained important because the empire needed officials who could read, draft, interpret, and preserve documents in a highly bureaucratic state. Educated men studied grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, theology, and law, often drawing on ancient Greek authors that Byzantium had never entirely stopped reading. This was not a simple survival of classical antiquity, because the curriculum changed over time and was shaped by Christian priorities. Still, the older literary tradition remained a major source of prestige. A learned courtier was expected to move easily between classical language, church doctrine, and administrative practice. Scholarship had a practical role. It was tied to public service rather than separated from it. Constantinople was the center of this world. The capital housed archives, libraries, churches, schools, monasteries, and the households of officials who depended on written culture for their careers. Much of the surviving intellectual life of Byzantium was concentrated there. Some scholars worked as teachers, some as clerks, some as theologians, and some as chroniclers who recorded events for later readers. Their writings are one of the main reasons the empire's history is so well known. At the same time, the sources must be read carefully. Court writers often praised the reigning emperor, defended official positions, or treated events in ways that suited political and religious assumptions. Modern historians rely on them, but they also compare them with legal texts, letters, seals, monastic records, and material evidence when possible. Ceremony was another defining feature of court culture. Byzantine rulers did not rely on military power alone. They also projected authority through ritual. The emperor received ambassadors, appeared in carefully ordered processions, sat beneath symbolic decoration, and took part in religious observances that linked the state to divine favor. This was not empty display. It helped manage rank, emphasize hierarchy, and communicate stability in a political system where personal loyalty mattered. A carefully staged audience or celebration told visiting envoys, provincial elites, and court insiders that imperial order still stood at the center of the world. Later writers, especially from outside the empire, sometimes described this ceremonial life as excessive or theatrical. In practice, it served a clear political purpose. It gave shape to a court that had to command respect across great distances. Diplomacy was closely connected to this culture. Because Byzantium sat between Latin Europe, the Islamic world, the Balkans, and the steppe frontier, it often relied on negotiation as much as force. Envoys were received with gifts, titles, promises, and carefully managed language. Foreign rulers might be drawn into Byzantine rank systems through honors that acknowledged them without fully admitting equality. Marriage alliances, tribute, subsidies, and trade agreements all became useful tools. The empire's diplomats were expected to be observant and patient. They needed to understand not just foreign leaders, but also the internal divisions of neighboring peoples. In many cases, the goal was not complete victory. It was to prevent a dangerous coalition from forming or to redirect a threat toward a rival. That habit of calculation became one of Byzantium's most distinctive strengths. The court also cultivated memory. Rulers wanted to present themselves as heirs to the Roman past, even as the empire became more Greek in language and more Christian in public identity. That meant commissioning histories, legal summaries, saints' lives, theological works, and ceremonial handbooks that explained how power should look and sound. These texts did more than record events. They taught the court how to understand itself. A successful emperor was not only a commander, he was a guardian of order, a patron of orthodoxy, and a figure who could link earthly government with sacred legitimacy. This is one reason Byzantine political culture often appears so self-conscious. It kept interpreting itself through older models while adapting them to present needs. At the same time, the brilliance of court life should not obscure its limits. The capital could appear highly polished even when the countryside was under strain. A strong ceremonial culture did not guarantee military security, and a learned bureaucracy could not by itself solve fiscal problems or frontier pressure. Yet the court's habits of scholarship and display gave the empire resilience. They allowed continuity when dynasties changed and helped preserve administrative knowledge across generations. They also gave Byzantium a way to present survival as legitimacy. The empire did not merely last, it explained its own endurance through law, faith, ceremony, and learning. That made court civilization more than a luxury of the capital. It became one of the ways Byzantium held itself together. The same people who copied manuscripts, composed theological arguments, and arranged formal audiences were also helping define what it meant to govern, to remember, and to belong to the imperial world. Court culture mattered partly because it rested on a wider social world. The capital preserved archives, ceremony, and theology, but most people lived far from the palace, in households, market towns, villages, and monasteries. Byzantine history is often told through emperors and wars, yet those larger events depended on ordinary habits of life. Families had to manage property, marry, raise children, and pass on faith and work. Farmers produced grain, wine, oil, and cloth under conditions that varied from region to region. Merchants, priests, soldiers, and monks each occupied a different part of the same imperial order. Together they made Byzantium not only a government, but a society. At the center of that society was the household. Byzantine families were usually smaller and more flexible than the idealized clans sometimes imagined in later tradition. Marriage linked households, property, and status, and it was regulated by both civil law and church teaching. In cities, families often lived close to workshops, churches, baths, and markets. In the countryside, kinship and inheritance shaped how land was divided and worked. Widows, orphans, and dependent relatives appear often in legal sources because they were part of everyday concern. The state and the church both tried to define proper household order, but the records show variation. People adapted to local conditions, changing fortunes and taxation. Family life was not separate from politics. It was one of the ways imperial society reproduced itself. Urban life, especially in Constantinople, followed its own rhythm. The capital was not only the seat of power, it was a large city of neighborhoods, churches, ports, workshops, and public gathering places. Markets brought goods from across the empire and beyond it. Bakers, metalworkers, sailors, scribes, and laborers all formed part of the city's economy. Religious festivals, imperial ceremonies, and feast days gave the calendar a public structure. In the streets and churches, people encountered the empire in familiar forms: processions, almsgiving, sermons, and the visible presence of the patriarch and imperial officials. Smaller cities shared some of this pattern, though on a reduced scale. Urban life depended on food supply, trade routes, and security. When those faltered, towns could decline. When they held, cities became places where imperial culture was copied, debated, and passed down. Beyond the walls, rural labor sustained nearly everything. Most Byzantines lived in the countryside, and the peasant household remained the basic unit of production. Farmers worked fields that varied sharply in fertility and ownership. Some held small plots, others labored on large estates or on land tied to monasteries, churches, or the state. The legal sources show an empire concerned with protection of property, but also with the practical need to keep land cultivated. Tax collection, military recruitment, and local defense all depended on village stability. In good years, the countryside could support towns and the army. In bad years, drought, war, or heavy taxation could unsettle entire districts. The empire's strength, therefore, rested on quiet routines that rarely appear in grand narratives: planting, harvesting, transporting goods, repairing tools, and negotiating obligations with landlords or officials. Monasteries added another layer to this world. They were places of prayer, but also of landholding, learning, charity, and memory. Monasticism had deep roots in Eastern Christianity, going back to the late Roman period and the traditions of the Desert Fathers and early ascetics. By the Middle Byzantine centuries, monasteries could be found in cities, on islands, in mountain regions, and near pilgrimage sites. Some were small communities, others became major institutions with estates, manuscripts, and political influence. Monks and nuns lived under rules that stressed discipline, obedience, and withdrawal from ordinary family life. Yet monasteries were never entirely separate from society. They received donations, resolved disputes, housed travelers, cared for the poor, and preserved texts. In times of conflict, they could also become centers of theological resistance or institutional pressure. Their importance grew not because they stood outside the empire, but because they were embedded in it. Religious practice shaped daily behavior far beyond monastery walls. Byzantine Christianity was not only expressed in doctrine and imperial ceremony. It was lived through baptism, marriage rites, funerals, fasting, feast days, pilgrimage, prayer, and the veneration of saints. Houses might contain icons, lamps, and devotional objects. Local churches anchored neighborhoods and villages. Saints' cults linked communities to places and stories, some rooted in early evidence and others enriched by later tradition. People looked for healing, protection, and guidance in ways that were both personal and communal. The sources show a faith that was highly organized and practical. It marked time, structured space, and gave meaning to ordinary hardship. At the same time, it connected local devotion to a larger Orthodox world defined by liturgy, bishops, scripture, and tradition. What emerges from all of this is a different view of Byzantium. It was not only the empire of emperors, councils, and fortifications. It was also a network of households, fields, workshops, churches, and monasteries that made imperial life possible from generation to generation. The court could display continuity, but the countryside and the city gave that continuity substance. Byzantine civilization was not just a refined political system. It was a lived order, carried by families, sustained by labor, shaped by prayer, and preserved in institutions that reached from the capital to the furthest provinces. By the Middle Byzantine period, the eastern and western halves of Christendom still shared scripture, the memory of Rome, and belief in Christ. In practice, however, they were drifting apart. The division did not begin in a single year or with one event. It developed gradually as the Eastern Empire remained more Greek in language and culture, while the churches of the West became more closely tied to Latin tradition and to the Bishop of Rome. language mattered. In the East, Greek remained the language of administration, theology, and educated life. In the West, Latin filled that role. Church disputes were often disputes about words, and words did not always carry the same meaning from one side to the other. Even when both sides aimed at the same doctrine, they explained it differently and assumed different patterns of authority. The East tended to value conciliar authority, in which bishops gathered in council represented the faith of the whole church. The Bishop of Rome was respected in the East, but that respect did not always imply direct rule over every other church. In the West, papal authority developed more expansively. That growth was shaped by history. As Roman power collapsed in the West, the Pope became a stabilizing figure in a changing political world. The Roman Church took on a different public role from the churches of the East, which still lived inside a functioning imperial system. By the time of the Macedonian emperors, East and West could still cooperate, especially on diplomacy or missionary work, but the cooperation depended on habits of deference and was often strained by disputes over jurisdiction. One of the best-known issues was the filioque, the phrase added in the Latin West to the Nicene Creed to say that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. The Greek East resisted both the theology and the precedent of changing an ecumenical creed without universal agreement. The dispute was not only about one sentence, it raised a larger question about who had the authority to alter formulas that belonged to the whole Christian world. Tensions sharpened in places where Latin missionaries and Greek clergy met directly, especially in southern Italy and the Balkans. Practical conflicts added to the pressure. The Byzantine court and the papacy each expected honor and recognition. When those expectations were not met, theological language could harden into political resentment. A major early clash came in the 9th century during the Photian controversy, when rivalry over the Patriarchate of Constantinople and disputes with Rome showed how far the two sides had drifted. It ended without resolving the deeper issues. Peace between East and West still depended on timing, compromise, and personal diplomacy. The tension remained visible in the 11th century. The date most often linked to the schism is 1054, when representatives of Pope Leo IX and Patriarch Michael I Cerularius exchanged excommunications in Constantinople. That event became a lasting symbol of division, but it was not an instant break. Many communities did not experience it as a single separation, and relations between East and West continued afterward in various forms. What changed was that shared institutional unity became much harder to maintain. The immediate causes of the 1054 crisis were partly liturgical and partly political. The Byzantine side objected to Latin customs such as unleavened bread in the Eucharist. The Latin side objected to what it saw as Byzantine irregularity and resistance to papal authority. These may seem minor beside war and empire, but in medieval Christianity ritual practice carried doctrinal meaning. Customs signaled who had the right to define orthodoxy. Where church authority and imperial authority were closely linked, disagreement over worship could become disagreement over governance. The wider political setting mattered too. Byzantium still called itself Roman, but it no longer ruled the entire Mediterranean world. In the West, new powers were rising, including the German emperors and the Norman rulers of southern Italy, both of whom had their own relationship with Rome. The papacy was becoming more assertive in that environment. Byzantium faced its own pressures on its eastern frontiers, in the Balkans, and in preserving internal order. Under those conditions, neither side had much room to accommodate the other. Even so, Byzantine and Latin Christianity still overlapped. Pilgrimage, diplomacy, trade, and later crusading contacts kept the two worlds connected. Western Europeans admired Constantinople's wealth and learning, even when they distrusted its refinement. Byzantines often regarded Latin Christians as rougher in manner and less precise in theology, while still recognizing them as fellow Christians. That mixture of familiarity and suspicion made the division more painful, because each side knew the other well enough to feel the distance. The split also changed Byzantium's place in the Christian world. The emperor could still present himself as protector of the faith, but not as ruler of a single Christian empire. The Patriarch of Constantinople remained powerful, yet he now stood in a church increasingly distinct from the Latin West. Over time, the gap became institutional as well as cultural. Liturgical languages, legal traditions, devotional customs, and political loyalties moved on separate tracks. By the end of this process, Roman Christian unity had not vanished in a single moment, but it had become difficult to recover. East and West still spoke of common belief, yet they no longer lived within one ecclesiastical order. When Byzantine rulers turned to the Latin West for help, they did so under pressure. The empire was still one of the best organized states in the Eastern Mediterranean, but its frontiers were more exposed than they had been in Justinian's day, and its resources were no longer enough to dominate every neighboring power at once. In the late 11th century, the Comnenian dynasty came to power in that setting. Its task was not to restore the old imperial system in full, it was to preserve what remained, recover what could be recovered, and stop the empire from shrinking further. Alexios Komnenos, who ruled from 981 to 1118, became the central figure in that effort. He inherited an empire weakened by military defeats, internal rivalry, and financial strain. The defeat at Manzikert in 1001 had not destroyed Byzantium by itself, but it had damaged imperial control in Anatolia, and Anatolia had long been one of the empire's main sources of soldiers, taxes, and local stability. Turkish forces and rival claimants took advantage of the disorder that followed. In the Balkans, the empire also faced pressure from Normans, Pechenegs, and other groups that could exploit a distracted court. Alexios responded with practical means. He reorganized the army as best he could, relied on family ties to secure loyalty at court, and used diplomacy, subsidies, and selective force rather than large battlefield victories alone. That mixture of methods defined the dynasty. Byzantine government had always combined war, negotiation, and administration, but under the Comnenians, that balance became more visible. Alexios understood that manpower was limited. He had to bargain, buy time, and choose where to fight. He also had to deal with a new problem: the First Crusade. Western armies crossing Byzantine territory were not simply allies or invaders, they were both. The empire needed help against the Turks, especially in Asia Minor, but it also needed to protect its own cities and preserve imperial authority. Alexios pressed the crusading leaders to swear oaths, promising that lands once held by Byzantium would be returned to imperial control. In practice, those expectations were often difficult to enforce, and later generations remembered the agreements differently. Even so, the arrangement showed the Comnenian approach. Byzantium would cooperate when necessary, but it would try to turn outside military movements to imperial advantage rather than let them pass beyond control. That strategy recovered some ground. Byzantine forces and diplomacy helped regain important coastal regions in western Anatolia, and the capital's position improved. But the recovery was partial. The empire could no longer command the whole peninsula as it had before 1071. Instead, it had to settle for a more defensible line and a more flexible frontier. That is why the Comnenian Age is often described as a revival without full restoration. The court was stronger, the army more coherent, and the throne more secure than it had been in the crisis decades. But the map had changed, and the empire had to live with that change. John II Komnenos, who ruled from 1118 to 1143, continued this work with less drama and often greater consistency. Contemporary writers praised his sobriety and discipline, and while such praise should be read carefully, it reflects the broader impression that his reign brought administrative steadiness after earlier turmoil. John spent much of his reign campaigning on the frontiers, especially in Anatolia and the Balkans. He did not launch grand ideological projects in the style of Justinian. Instead, he focused on holding terrain, keeping regional rivals under pressure, and maintaining the imperial presence where it mattered most. His reign mattered because it showed that recovery depended less on dazzling victories than on repeated acts of maintenance. The next emperor, Manuel I Komnenos, ruled from 1143 to 1180 and pushed the dynasty in a more outward-facing direction. Manuel was energetic, ambitious, and deeply involved in diplomacy with both the Latin West and the Islamic powers to the east. He ruled in a world that had become more interconnected and more unstable. The Crusader states in the Levant, the Norman kingdom in southern Italy, the German emperors, the Hungarian kingdom, and the Seljuk Turks all formed part of the same strategic environment. Byzantium could not ignore any of them. Manuel therefore tried to balance them carefully, sometimes aligning with one group against another, sometimes making marriage alliances, and sometimes using imperial ceremony to project authority beyond what military force alone could guarantee. This was one of the defining features of the Comnenian Age. Byzantine diplomacy was not a sign of weakness in itself. It was a sophisticated tool that reflected the empire's long experience. But it also revealed the limits of Byzantine strength because negotiation was increasingly necessary with powers that once would have been treated more as neighbors than peers. The empire was still rich enough to matter, still organized enough to compete, and still prestigious enough to attract attention. But it was no longer secure enough to dominate its environment without compromise. That tension became especially clear in relations with the Crusaders. The First Crusade had passed through Byzantine lands under strained but workable arrangements. Later crusading movements were more difficult. Latin lords in the Eastern Mediterranean often wanted their own autonomy, not imperial supervision. Byzantine emperors, for their part, saw reason to distrust Latin promises, especially when crusading enthusiasm gave way to practical ambition. The Second Crusade brought further examples of this friction. Western armies moved through Byzantine territory, and while formal cooperation remained possible, the atmosphere was much less cooperative than crusade writers in the West often imagined. Each side interpreted the other through its own assumptions. To the Byzantines, Latin forces could seem unpredictable and too ready to pursue private advantage. To many Latin nobles, Byzantine caution could appear evasive or manipulative. Those attitudes did not create a clean break at once, but they steadily narrowed the space for trust. At the same time, the empire's eastern frontier remained under pressure from the Turks. Anatolia was not lost in a single step, and it was not regained in a single campaign. It became a zone of mixed control, local negotiation, and military adaptation. Fortified positions, regional commanders, and shifting alliances all mattered. The imperial center could still project power, but it had to do so through a thinner administrative and military apparatus than before. In that sense, the Comnenian state was more personalized than the older Roman model had been. Family networks, court connections, and loyal provincial magnates became especially important. This did not mean that the empire lacked institutions. It meant that institutions increasingly worked through the dynasty and the people it trusted. Manuel's reign also showed how expensive such a system could be. Military campaigns, diplomacy, and the maintenance of prestige all cost money. So did keeping allies, mercenaries, and frontier commanders in service. The imperial treasury was not inexhaustible, and when the state tried to sustain a wide strategic reach, financial pressures accumulated. The empire could still project confidence, but that confidence depended on continuing success. If one part of the system failed, the rest became harder to support. By the later 12th century, that was increasingly clear. The Comnenian emperors had restored a measure of strength, especially compared with the turmoil of the late 11th century. They had kept Constantinople central, preserved an imperial court of high culture and ceremony, and maintained a real presence in regional politics. But they had also inherited a world that was harder to control than the one the early emperors had known. The old Roman Mediterranean was gone. In its place stood a crowded frontier system with Latin crusader states, Turkish principalities, Serbian and Hungarian powers in the Balkans, and a Byzantine Empire that was still powerful but no longer able to set the terms everywhere. That was the real achievement of the Comnenian Age. It did not restore the empire to its earlier scale, but it kept the empire alive in a harder age. When the first crusading armies moved east at the end of the 11th century, Byzantine rulers did not see them simply as enemies. At first, they looked like an uncertain answer to a serious problem. Alexios I Komnenos had asked the Latin West for help against the Seljuk Turks, and the response soon became difficult to manage. The First Crusade sent large armed forces through imperial territory, and Alexios tried to turn that passage into an alliance. He required oaths promising the return of lands once held by the empire, and in some cases he received them. But the Byzantines and the Crusaders were never working from the same assumptions. The empire wanted recovered cities, restored revenue, and secure borders. Many Crusaders wanted a road to the Holy Land and then a share in the territories they conquered. That difference was clear from the beginning. Crusader leaders passed through Constantinople with a mixture of need and suspicion. Byzantine officials saw Western soldiers who were useful but hard to trust. Latin writers often described the empire as wealthy, refined, and politically evasive, and those impressions fed later hostility. There were practical sources of friction as well. The empire expected the Crusaders to hand over former Byzantine cities such as Nicaea once they were taken. In some cases that happened. In others, the Crusaders kept what they had captured or founded states of their own. Antioch became one of the clearest examples. It had long mattered to Byzantine interests, but it fell under Latin rule and remained there. The First Crusade restored some lost ground in Asia Minor, but it also introduced a new Western power into the Eastern Mediterranean, Christian in name and often independent in practice. The empire quickly learned that these newcomers could not be treated exactly like former subjects or like familiar diplomatic partners, but Byzantine policy became more careful and more demanding. Emperors used ceremony, gifts, marriages, titles, and carefully staged negotiations to keep Latin leaders within a framework the court could control. In Byzantine political culture, ritual expressed hierarchy. It helped the empire present itself as the senior power even when military reality was less certain. But crusading leaders answered to their own feudal ties, their own religious aims, and their own local ambitions. The result was a relationship that could move from cooperation to resentment very quickly. During the 12th century, the pattern repeated. The Second Crusade passed through Byzantine territory under far less trust than the first, and the damage caused by unruly Crusader forces deepened suspicion on both sides. Manuel I Komnenos tried to manage the Latins with a mixture of firmness and openness. He negotiated with Western rulers, used their rivalries to his advantage, and sometimes employed Latin mercenaries in imperial service. At the same time, he knew that Western armies moving across the Balkans and Anatolia could become dangerous if they were not controlled. The empire was still strong enough to influence events, but not strong enough to dictate them outright. That produced a politics of constant bargaining. By the later 12th century, relations had grown more complicated because the empire itself was changing internally. Manuel's foreign policy aimed at prestige and reach, but it also depended on expensive military and diplomatic commitments. The Latin presence in the Eastern Mediterranean expanded as Crusader states matured, Italian merchants won larger privileges, and Western rulers became more deeply involved in Byzantine affairs. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa all sought commercial advantages in imperial ports, and those advantages mattered because maritime trade was now tied directly to imperial revenue and court politics. The Byzantines depended on shipping and finance, but privileges granted to Italians also reduced the state's direct control over its own trade. Cooperation with the West was becoming unequal. It was no longer only about moving crusaders across territory. It was also about money, ports, law, and influence. The Third Crusade added another layer. By then, the loss of Jerusalem to Saladin had changed the atmosphere of crusading. Frederick Barbarossa's passage through Byzantine territory again showed how tense these relationships had become. Imperial officials worried about Western armies that could claim to be allies while behaving like occupiers in transit. The Byzantines, for their part, had reason to fear being caught between the ambitions of Western emperors, Latin principalities, and their own Eastern rivals. Every encounter carried the possibility of misunderstanding. Every promise had to be judged against what might happen if the other side failed to keep it. The Fourth Crusade exposed the consequences of that long mistrust in the clearest way. Its original target was Egypt, not Constantinople, but Crusader politics, papal pressure, Venetian maritime interests, and the unstable condition of Byzantine succession all pulled the expedition toward the empire itself. That shift did not happen all at once, and historians still debate the exact balance of motives at each stage. What is not disputed is that the Crusaders became entangled in Byzantine dynastic conflict, especially after the struggles involving Alexios III and the young Alexios IV. A claimant who promised money, support, and reunion of the churches could not deliver what he had pledged, and once the promised aid failed to appear, distrust hardened into hostility. Venetian interests mattered greatly as well, because the crusade depended on Venetian shipping, and Venice had its own commercial and strategic reasons to push events in a direction that favored it. By 1204, the expedition had turned decisively against Constantinople. The sack of the city was not a sudden accident in an otherwise peaceful relationship. It was the result of years of mistrust, political opportunism, and failed coordination between two Christian worlds that had come to see each other less as partners than as obstacles. The city was plundered, holy places were violated, and imperial authority was shattered. Contemporary Greek and Latin accounts describe the event with shock, though from sharply different perspectives. For Byzantium, it was a civilizational rupture. The imperial capital had fallen not to Persians or Arabs, but to Western Christians who had entered the city under the banner of liberation. Afterward, the empire did not simply disappear, it fragmented. Byzantine elites established successor states at Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond, each claiming some form of Roman legitimacy. But the center had been broken, and restoring it would take decades. The Crusaders and Venetians divided much of Constantinople and the former imperial heartland among themselves, creating a Latin empire that was weaker than it looked and deeply dependent on outside support. The old pattern had changed again. Latin intervention in Byzantine affairs was no longer just uneasy cooperation at the frontier or negotiated passage through imperial lands. The sack of 1204 did not end Byzantine political history, but it changed the conditions under which that history could continue. Once Constantinople was broken apart, the question was no longer only how the empire would defend its borders. It was whether any Roman imperial center could be rebuilt at all. For the next generation, that depended on military survival, dynastic legitimacy, and the recovery of the capital from Latin hands. The Latin Empire created after the Crusader conquest was never as secure as its founders hoped. It held Constantinople and some nearby territory, and Venice gained important commercial privileges, but the new regime had shallow roots. Its rulers faced resistance from Greek populations, rivalry from neighboring powers, and constant financial weakness. The Crusaders had taken an imperial capital, but they had not inherited the administrative depth that had once made the city the center of a vast state. Latin rule depended on outside reinforcement and on a fragile balance among Crusader leaders, Venetians, and local allies. Meanwhile, Byzantine authority reappeared in several surviving centers. Nicaea, in northwestern Asia Minor, became the most important of these successor states. Its rulers presented themselves not as rebels, but as the lawful continuation of Roman imperial government. That claim mattered because Byzantine legitimacy had always rested on continuity. A ruler did not simply seize power. He inherited a system, defended the church, and upheld the idea that Roman order had not vanished. At Nicaea, that argument was made with unusual care. The city stood close enough to Constantinople to keep recovery in view, yet far enough away to build a functioning government beyond Latin control. Epirus became another center of power in the Western Balkans. It developed under its own ruling house and at times projected real strength into the region around Thessalonica. Yet its claims to imperial authority competed with those of Nicaea, so the years after 1204 were not a single unified restoration movement. They were a contest among Greek-led states, each trying to preserve something from the old empire while advancing its own position. Trebizond, far to the east on the Black Sea coast, also maintained a separate imperial court under the Komnenos line. Its rulers adopted imperial titles and preserved a regional presence, though their state developed on a different geographic and political scale from Nicaea or Epirus. Later historians group these polities as successor states, but the term can hide how different their ambitions were. Nicaea was the one most clearly oriented toward reclaiming Constantinople itself. That goal became clearer as the 13th century moved on. The Latin Empire endured, but it remained weak. It faced enemies on several sides, had limited resources, and lacked the broader imperial apparatus that had once supported Constantinople. The Greek states, by contrast, could draw on older administrative habits, church structures, and regional loyalty. Nicaea, in particular, benefited from continuity in bureaucracy and from the support of an Orthodox religious establishment that regarded Latin rule with deep suspicion. The Patriarchate, displaced from the capital, helped preserve the idea that the empire still existed somewhere, even if not in its original seat. This is one reason 1204 mattered so deeply. It did not merely produce a military defeat. It created a rival version of Roman continuity. The Latins claimed rightful conquest. The Greeks claimed lawful restoration. Both sides understood that control of Constantinople was symbolic as well as practical. Whoever held the city could present himself as the true emperor. Whoever lost it had to govern in exile or from a reduced and contested base. During the decades after the sack, the balance slowly shifted. Nicaea became stronger than its rivals through diplomacy, warfare, and patient administration. Its rulers consolidated Western Asia Minor, managed relations with surrounding Turkish powers, and built enough internal stability to support a serious bid for the capital. The state did not recover by force alone. It survived by avoiding collapse, keeping institutions intact, and exploiting the overextension of its enemies. That kind of recovery was less dramatic than sudden reconquest, but it was more realistic. Eventually, the opportunity came when the Latin Empire weakened further and the political map around Constantinople changed again. The city was retaken in 1261 by forces loyal to Nicaea under Michael VIII Palaiologos. In formal terms, that looked like restoration. The imperial capital was back in Byzantine hands, the court returned, and the old ceremonial center was reoccupied. Yet the recovery was incomplete from the start. The empire that entered Constantinople was not the same one that had ruled there before 1204. Its resources were smaller, its enemies more numerous, and its confidence permanently altered. The intervening years had shown that Byzantine legitimacy could survive the loss of the capital, but they had also shown how difficult it was to rebuild the whole imperial system after such a rupture. So the result of 1204 was a shattered but not extinct Byzantium. The empire was divided into fragments, then slowly gathered back into one political center, though on diminished terms. The return to Constantinople would matter enormously for the next phase of the story, but it would not erase what had happened. The memory of the sack remained present in diplomacy, in church relations, and in the way Byzantines understood their place in the wider world. The recovery of Constantinople did not restore the old empire in full. Michael VIII Palaiologos brought the capital back, but he inherited a state that was smaller, more exposed, and far more dependent on bargaining than on force. Much of Asia Minor, once a major source of soldiers and taxes, had already been lost to Turkish rulers. In the Balkans, neighboring powers had grown stronger during the years of fragmentation. At sea, Italian maritime republics controlled much of the trade that still passed through the eastern Mediterranean. Byzantium remained an empire, but it now had far fewer tools than before. That narrower reality shaped the final centuries. The Palaiologan emperors kept the language of Roman universality, along with court ritual, imperial titles, and familiar forms of legitimacy, but they ruled under conditions that made recovery unlikely. Diplomacy had to be cautious because the empire could not fight prolonged wars on several fronts. Finances stayed thin because the tax base had shrunk. Armies were small because the state no longer had the manpower it once commanded. Survival depended on balancing stronger neighbors against one another, making temporary agreements, and accepting that the center could no longer control the edges. Yet the Palaeologan period was not only a story of decline. Constantinople remained a cultural and religious center even as its political reach narrowed. Scholars, clerics, and officials continued to copy manuscripts, write theology, preserve classical learning, and maintain older administrative habits. The court was less powerful than it had been under Justinian or the Macedonian emperors, but it still carried prestige. Byzantium could no longer expand broadly, yet it remained a functioning state. That distinction matters, because the empire did not vanish when its borders contracted. It continued to operate, and that gave its final centuries their character. One of the strongest pressures in this period came from the Ottoman Turks. Their rise changed the balance of power in Anatolia and the Balkans in ways Byzantium could not reverse. Earlier Turkish states had already weakened imperial control in Asia Minor, but the Ottomans proved more durable, more organized, and more capable of steady expansion. They pressed against Byzantine territory from several directions. Cities, forts, and regional holdings fell away one by one. The remaining empire became increasingly fragmented, and Byzantine rulers were often reduced to asking not how they might recover lost ground, but how they might keep what was left. That shrinking map changed the relationship between the emperor and the world around him. Constantinople still mattered, but it now presided over a far smaller realm than the title Roman Empire suggested. Some provincial centers became isolated. Some regions survived only through local defense arrangements or temporary understandings with stronger powers. Ottoman advance made each of those adjustments more urgent. By the late medieval period, Byzantine politics were often shaped by immediate survival rather than broad imperial planning. The institutions were ancient, but the options were narrow. The outside world also added pressure. Western Europe had its own ambitions, and the Byzantine court continued to seek help from Latin powers through military appeals, diplomatic concessions, and church union negotiations that often stirred deep controversy at home. These efforts reflected the empire's basic strategic problem. Byzantium needed allies, but its likely allies usually came with conditions many Byzantines distrusted. The memory of 1204 still mattered, and that made trust difficult. As a result, diplomacy was careful, complicated, and constrained by the fact that almost every choice carried some cost. Religious life remained central throughout. Byzantine society had long tied imperial authority to Orthodox Christianity, and that link persisted as the state weakened. Monasteries, church institutions, and theological writing continued to shape public life. Debates over union with the Latin Church became especially important in the later centuries because they were never only about doctrine. They were also about whether political survival might require religious compromise. Some accepted that possibility, others rejected it. The result was a recurring tension in which theology and statecraft were closely linked. Byzantium was defending not only territory, but a particular understanding of itself. Still, the empire did not collapse at once. For a long time, it endured through habit, memory, and improvisation. Even when territory disappeared, the capital remained. Even when armies weakened, the court still functioned. Even when emperors depended on foreign support, the idea of the Roman Empire in the East retained political force. That sense of continuity helped Byzantium survive longer than a less durable state might have. But continuity alone could not overcome material weakness forever. By the 15th century, Constantinople itself had become the last major prize. The city was still impressive in ceremonial terms, but its population had declined, and its defenses no longer matched the empire's reduced resources. The Palaeologan rulers still sat on the throne of the Romans, but the title now carried more history than power. Surrounding regions had been lost, and the Ottoman state had become the dominant force in the area. The final years were not a sudden collapse, but the end point of a long process in which each loss made the next one harder to resist. The siege and fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked the end of Byzantine political independence. Contemporary accounts describe the assault in detail, though later retellings often added dramatic elements beyond the evidence. What is clear is that the city was overwhelmed by a force the empire could no longer match. The death of Constantine XI, the capture of the capital, and its absorption into Ottoman power closed the last chapter of imperial rule. After that, no Byzantine state remained to continue the old Roman line in political form. Even so, the ending was not erasure. Byzantine law, theology, artistic traditions, diplomatic practice, and political memory continued to shape the worlds that followed. Orthodox Christianity carried much of that inheritance forward. Greek scholarship survived in new settings. Legal and administrative traditions influenced later institutions. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire had been reduced from a Mediterranean power to one great city and a few outposts. Its fall to the Ottomans ended imperial rule, but not the world Byzantium had made. For more than 1,000 years, the empire had survived by adapting Roman institutions to changing languages, religions, enemies, and borders. That flexibility could not save its territory, but it helped preserve its culture. What remained after the conquest was a dispersed inheritance. Orthodox Christianity carried Byzantine religious life forward. Greek learning moved into new centers. Courts, law, ceremony, and art outlived the state that had sustained them. Byzantium began as Rome's eastern continuation, and it ended as a defeated empire whose traditions kept moving long after its borders were gone.